Um, just FYI, my Wi-Fi's been a little odd. So like in a past round, I just like randomly left in the middle of a speech. So when I'm not speaking, I'm gonna turn my Wi-Fi off. I mean my camera off. So hopefully I don't exit randomly. Okay. Um, well, if everyone's ready, great. Um, I will begin my time in 3, 2, 1. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Levine, and I'm really proud to be the Prime Minister on this motion. So this House regrets utilitarianism being the default framework in Parli. So we're going to define this House as like a rational actor kind of looking at this, and then we're going to define utils like net benefits for the most people, right? Like this is kind of like the general idea of morality that is used in Parli, and then the framework here is going to be the consequences it's had to like high school debaters and the high school debate like world. So the kind of framing that I want to do here is saying that this isn't like around about like util versus other kinds of morality. It's about util specifically used in debate and how that's been harmful. So we're not like arguing about like philosophically what's the right like framework for morality. We're arguing about like how util and like has like negatively or positively in op case affected the culture of Parli and how Parli debaters view the world. That's kind of like what we're thinking about, as opposed to just like philosophically like what's the right way to like measure your life. We're thinking about it specifically in terms of Parli. Okay, so first to get into this, my first contention is about why util uniquely gives high school debaters a bad and less nuanced understanding of morality. So there are a few problems with util. One, it's subjective. Like who decides what is best for the most people, right? It's like a very individualized kind of morality. Everyone decides what they personally believe and they apply it to everyone else. It's impossible for someone to decide what's best for someone else. Like what if the best thing for like the whole group is like to sacrifice one person every year? Like the most common example of this in history is like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like you're making lives horrible for a smaller group of people to like what, and like it was justified by saying that, oh, we were making lives better for like a larger group of people. Like it was justified through utilitarianism. Like this is implemented in a very non-nuanced way where like you kind of make excuses for doing huge damage to like to smaller groups of people under the guise of saying, oh, like it could have been worse. So the second reason why util is like non-nuanced and kind of bad for high schoolers is that there are a lot of second order effects that high schoolers don't have to consider. So like there are a lot of things, like example, like the trolley problem, right? Like if you kill one person to save 5 people, but like then like you don't know like who's in the 5 people, who that one person is, right? Like there are a lot of questions about like what the specifics are of these people. Like are the 5 people like convicted like murderers? Like is the one person like a really big good person who like works in a nonprofit? Like we don't know, right? But the point is that util ignores a lot of these nuances. The third problem with util is that it robs people of agency. Like in an entirely utilitarian world, then we would have like organ farming, right? Like we would say, oh yeah, like it's great because like certain people need organs, so like let's like violate like people's bodily autonomy and give them these organs. Like we would say that that's probably bad because we don't want to be violating people's autonomy and their like agency and deciding what they want to happen to their bodies. But in a purely utilitarian world, we would agree that that's a good thing. So why is this uniquely bad for high school debaters? 3 reasons. One, high school debaters are teenagers, their brains have not developed, and so they're going to be super susceptible to this. If you're arguing 5 rounds on a Saturday and then like 3 or 4 rounds on a Sunday, all arguing about utilitarianism, like you're bound to view the entire world in that way. Like debaters tend to apply what they discuss in their rounds to like their life. They apply it to their classes, to like their essays, whatever they write. Like this kind of thing permeates their lives, it permeates their ideas, and it permeates most of the things that they do. So why is this a net negative for debaters? Because it means that they have a less nuanced take on things. So this leads to my second reason about like why this is bad for debaters. It's because it leads to like very non-nuanced kind of cheap arguments that lead to debaters treating people as things and numbers that you can quantify. So how does that like really harm debaters and like debate as a whole? Because when debaters are making like utilitarian arguments, they're like valuing certain groups above another one, and that can lead to really harmful, offensive rhetoric and really insensitive rhetoric. Why is this bad? It creates an unsafe space for debaters. Like maybe people who are part of that marginalized group are going to feel really uncomfortable. They're not going to want to return to debate, and that's going to lead to a less diverse, less inclusive debate environment. Or if these people are using this harmful rhetoric and no one calls them out on it, or like if it works and they win the round because it's under utilitarianism, then they're going to be like they're basically being told, oh, it's a good thing that you're using this like rhetoric that quantifies people as like numbers and assigns value to these things. Basically what we see here is not only is util bad in terms of like how it views like the nuance of and the complexities of humanity, but it also uniquely harms debaters, because when they implement this kind of thinking, this very narrow one-sided thinking into debate rounds and their real life, it not only alienates them from other people, but it also harms the debate space by making it less inclusive and making it more hostile, especially to marginalized groups. So the second reason, the contention that we have here, is that it makes debaters worse. So what happens here is that debaters only have to think about a problem through like one specific lens. Like everyone's go-to is just like utilitarianism. They don't have to think about like why another framework might be better or might be worse, because that's kind of the normalized like idea. Like when someone tries to propose a different framework, they have to argue about it. They have to prove it. No one ever has to prove why they want to like argue utilitarianism. What does this do? Three things. One, it diminishes the idea of like other veins of thought, other ideas of morality. It discourages people from arguing them because it takes up a lot of their time in rounds. Two, what it does is it encourages debaters to kind of like take this cheap way out again, right? Like crunching the numbers on like certain morality things and winning arguments based on like basically assigning values to groups of people and types of people. And three, what this does is that it makes debaters not think about like rounds holistically and more about like how they can win each point specifically. Debate has become, because of this utilitarian framework, it's become something where people don't think about it like on the whole. They don't think about it like as a net problem. They think about it as a way to win that specific round. Why is this bad? We argue that debate is not something that's like just like important for high school. It's about learning skills that you can apply to your future, right? It's about learning how to communicate, learning how to express yourself, learning how to convince other people of your side. But when you're only focusing on how to win under a super like technical, like rigid framework that like is very kind of like one side and very black and white, then you're not actually gaining all of those skills that are important to get when you have debate. You're not able to like be flexible within the realm. You're not being able to like adjust to different ideas. You're not able to actually see things from different perspectives because everyone's debating under utilitarianism. What does this mean? This means that debaters don't actually get like those life skills that they could have gotten from high school debate, and they're not able to helpfully implement them. It means that they're more close-minded. It means that they're more likely to like make these kind of harmful statements about groups of people, because under util they're generalizing, right? They're valuing certain groups just like based on like, you know, whatever serves like the majority of people. It's a very one-side way of thinking. It can be very exclusive and very harmful to marginalized groups. So who are the people that are harmed specifically on side gov? Why is utilitarianism being the default framework bad? We not only harm marginalized people and exclude them from debate, we also harm all of debaters because they get worse at debating. They're less critical thinkers, they're less independent thinkers, and we harm debate like as an environment as a whole because it's more exclusive, because it's more hostile, and because there's less diversity of thought in it. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
Okay, great speech, per usual. Everyone's ready? I'll begin my time starting now. Jenny gives you a great gov case. The problem with it lies in the fact that she doesn't consider the counterfactuals in what happens in a world where util isn't the default weighing mechanism. Because when util isn't the default weighing mechanism, it creates a less accessible and less productive debate space we are so proud to oppose. A few things in this speech, first going to go through one tiny topic case thing, then going to go into op case, and then going to do some responses to gov case. Only thing I want to talk about topic case is on top of the framework of, oh, what this did in terms of consequences and benefits to high school debate, that stuff. We also want to talk about the benefits to the quality of debate, like as well to the debate kits outside of the debate space. But I also think the importance is like the quality of the debate rounds, because that's why we debate. We want to actually have good quality debate rounds. Jenny wants to contest this, but I think it's generally a pretty normal thing to do. That being said, let's get into our two contentions. First, on why this is going to be beneficial to the quality of the debate round, and secondly, on why any alternatives would be worse. Let's start on our first subpoint of 4. First, we think that util is more accurate to society. Importantly, we think that a framework of utilitarianism is far more accurate to the way the world works. This is important because it makes you think of the purpose of debate. Debate exists to teach us how to engage in the real world, to make critical and logical arguments that convince people and make sense. Importantly, as interesting as Buddhism and deontology may be to discuss, they are far less applicable to society. We think if the default in Parli was not util, it would lead to 3 main negative impacts in terms of how it impacted us in our accuracy of society. The first negative impact is we would probably become somewhat of a joke format, something similar to ethics bowl. If you're arguing for something that isn't applicable to society, you're not arguing for a debate round, you're arguing about hypothetical thought experiments, which is cool, but not what parliamentary debate is supposed to be. The second negative impact that would happen here would be that people would not be as equipped to have discussions about utilitarian issues in real life. I'm sorry, but if I'm having a discussion in my history class about, I don't know, Hunter Biden's indictment, and people start talking about the deontological impacts of that, that's not really going to equip me for my real life, because all I've ever learned is how to be moral and only be objective and tell the truth all of the time. I don't understand how to actually engage in real life conversations, which means debate is less useful. Third and final negative impact of this is that debate would exist as a thought experiment with less clearly defined lines. If this is the way the world works, you don't actually know what's going to happen in terms of tangible benefits, lives, happiness, benefits to marginalized groups, which we'll talk about why they can also be important under util, are all super important in util. When you're having something like Buddhism, minimizing suffering, and something like deont, where you have to follow these ideas given by Kant, it's really, really hard to quantify exactly how you should be. This makes you more accurate, more accessible. The second reason that we think overall we're benefiting the quality of debate is on accessibility. We think util debate makes more accessibility for two groups of people. First, debaters, second, observers and judges. First, for the debaters, we think util allows any debater to easily join Parli. They don't need any prior philosophy knowledge and whatnot. East Coasters know this. Let's be real. The reason we complain about West Coast Californian debate is because they have Ks, which are all weird philosophical arguments that people don't understand because they don't have the philosophy backbone to do it. Util, on the other hand, people do understand. It's easy to slide into. People can understand how to debate in that debate round. That's overall going to be more productive. More people have access to the debate, and the debate space becomes more inclusive. The second group of people are the observers. We think for observers, they're probably going to have no idea what's happening if they try and come into a debate round. Imagine trying to find judges. You'd have no one who knew what to do because there'd be different philosophical frameworks every round. Any person can judge a Parli round, and that's because it makes sense. Any observer can understand the arguments we're making because it applies to real life. In this world, it doesn't do that as well. Third reason that overall we're going to be benefiting the quality of debate is because it keeps people on their feet. We think because util is the default, it trains you to be better at Parli specifically. This may be counterintuitive, but think about it. When util is the default, everyone has to think on their feet when someone proposes a new weighing mechanism. When someone says, no, this is going to be deontological, that means you actually have to do the Parli thing of like, oh, I have to be on my spot, come up with a new argument really, really quickly. We think that's really, really productive. It teaches you a skill that no other format of debate can use. That's really, really good. And when you have these utilitarian ideas and overall these ideas of how to respond to new arguments, that's going to treat you and teach you how to react on your feet more quickly. This means people are probably going to be better in situations later on in life, better at reacting on their feet. Fourth and final reason this benefits the quality of debate is because it requires better weighing. Jenny tells you herself, since util is a little subjective and since util is the default framework, everyone basically understands that they have to weigh the round very clearly. In weighing, it forces people to think more creatively because you can't just say, oh, under util we win. No, you have to say, oh, under util we actually help the marginalized groups, which is the most severe benefit and has the largest impact because it's going to affect them the most. You have to talk about what's the most important. Is happiness a larger impact for the most amount of people, or is ending suffering more important? Importantly, that means people need to actually tackle the life issues and real things that go on in society and talk about marginalized groups. They have to talk about other things as well, but they do have to talk about all of the harms Jenny talks about. Our second contention is on harms of alternatives. We think there are two general alternatives that can form if you don't have util as the default. First, you have no default where it changes every round, or second, you pick a different default. We're going to talk about both and why they're bad. First, here's why no default is bad. When there's no default, that means you have a framework debate every single round. Framework debate kind of sucks. To be honest, when there's no default, that would mean that it would be changing every single round. You'd have less time dedicated to the actual arguments and more time spent at top of case. Plus, framework debate is entirely subjective. Like you cannot decide who's actually right on framework. There are benefits to each framework. And yeah, you can win it really well, but you win it through tech. You don't win it through your actual logical reasoning. And it's going to be the same round every time. It wastes time. It is not as productive of a debate space. And we'd rather there not be no default framework. The second option here is that there's a different default every single time. Two reasons why this is worse. First, it's inherently less accessible. It takes a line of reasoning to explain util. Any other framework like deont or negative util takes days, weeks, even months to explain and fully conceptualize its positives and negatives. Emily still says she doesn't really understand deont after 3 years of debate. Importantly, you need a really, really large philosophy education to understand these frameworks. That means that if you don't have access to that, it's really hard to get into debate. But the second option and second reason it's probably not good to have these defaults is because a philosophy education is hard enough to get in college, yet high school. So only the people go to private high schools with philosophy courses or high schools with well-informed debate teams and coaching or money for private tutors can really understand the depth of these philosophical frameworks, making Parli less accessible and allowing fewer people to debate. Let's do some responses. On their first contention on non-nuanced and bad for high schoolers, I first want to make an observation. We think there's a difference between the definition of util and how it actually manifests in debate. Jenny tells you it's subjective. That's important because people, maybe Merriam-Webster tells you that util will concern certain crimes or give the rich the same amount of money as the poor. However, in practice, in debate rounds, util acts as a basic metric. People aren't going to say war crimes are okay if it's the largest utilitarian benefit. People debate based off of what is going to be the most subjectively positive impact for the most amount of people that doesn't cause suffering. So even if there are bad things about util, we think it is adapted to debate to a level where you're only going to be prioritizing impacts that are actually like normal in society. Some more responses, two mainly that I want to highlight. First, it's subjectivity. The subjectivity of util is what makes it special. People get to argue what is going to be the most important, meaning people have to think on their feet, learn more. They get to decide and evaluate the different issues of people's struggles, what's more important, and actually have conversations about that. Second, they talk about examples like the trolley problem. These don't work. These are philosophical thought experiments on util versus deont. Yeah, you don't have all the context, but when you analyze the different situations on how you're saving lives, that's more applicable to real world and better. The second contention they talk about, oh, this makes debaters worse. First, an observation again, we think the culprit's not necessarily the weighing mechanism. The reason debaters have like their own preconceived biases are because of how they think about the world and the arguments they make. We think we'd rather people just win on their arguments and they can adjust to new arguments and ideas rather than new weighing mechanisms. At the point at which we benefit the quality of debate, we are so proud to oppose.
Wow, I have not heard Sophie debate in a while. And wow, she's still great. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, great. So just before I start my time, basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into like line by line refutation, and then I'll talk about like some overall top of case things, and then I'll go into gov if I have time. Okay, so I will begin my time in 3, 2, 1. So first of all, I want to clarify something that Op kind of like has a misconception about, like the idea that like util still won't be a framework. Like util will still be an option as a framework, right? It's just like it won't be the default. So I think we're going to take what they give us in their C2 about how like there's going to be like everyone's just going to like pick like per round, like it's going to be different every round. Like that's one that we want to take here. It's basically going to be like we don't want a default framework. We don't want people to default to something. We want people to pick things like kind of as they go. That's kind of an overall thing I want to touch on. So now they talk about how util is more accurate to society, and so it's more practical. So two responses here. The first one is that like it's not necessarily about like being able to like talk about practical issues, because like nobody really wants to hear like a high schooler's opinion on a lot of practical issues. What it does teach you is how to communicate your ideas for when like you are like an important prominent figure, right? Like no one's going to be watching this round and say, oh yeah, like we should totally change this. But when like this like 10 years later, like Sophie or Emily and I will all know how to talk about like how debate has impacted us, right? Like we'll be able to clearly communicate that. It's not about like implementing like the knowledge that you get from Parli like immediately. This is kind of like a long-term gain, right? When you do Parli when you're young, you're able to like be able to communicate yourself more easily, more clearly later on in life. It's not this kind of like immediate like you do this and then you get better thing. It's more like over time you grow these skill sets. So a lot of their points, like yeah, like we totally agree, but we don't think that they like won't be able to engage in the real world. We think that people are actually going to be better equipped to like talk to different people with different perspectives instead of just like the same people who have like the same agreed on like playing field. And that comes into our second point, which is the idea like our second refutation to this, which is about like the idea of polarization. So what Op does is they kind of assume that everyone's going to have like the same general idea of like the importance of something or how to measure it. And I think we can see in our current political landscape that that's just like not true. Like people have vastly different conceptions of what the world is like, how the world should be, how the world should be valued. Like right now, like our government is probably going to close down in like a few days because of how polarized like our government is, right? Like it's because people can't decide on things, people can't agree on things. So clearly, like we don't have like a shared idea of like what reality is or like what like the truth is or like what is like best for America. So like clearly this isn't really something that like we can like see in today. So therefore, it's actually more important to be able to understand when people have different ideas of like what's important to them, when people have different frameworks that they lead their life with. It's actually going to better equip the high schoolers to deal with that in their future, because the future that they're going into is not one where everyone has this like shared idea of what's important. It's one where people have vastly different things, and you have to discuss it with all of them. You have to be able to engage with all of them in order to have productive conversations. Then they talk about accessibility. They say that it allows like debaters to easily join Parli, and they give this example of Ks. They talk about how Ks are like weirdly philosophical and how they're really hard to access. So my first reputation to this is that like Ks were actually created like as a way to help marginalized groups gain access to debate. Like they would criticize like the actual structure, like the concept of debate. So like Black debaters would do this, like female debaters would talk about like certain issues that they faced, structural inequities in debate, and they would explain why like that was more important than anything else in the round. They made like certain inequalities, they brought that to the forefront. They said we should weigh this debate on this because that's the most important thing. They changed the framework as a way to make debate more accessible. So we would argue that like the people who created the format of Parli debate was like the British parliamentary like government, right? Like a bunch of like older white men who like believed in like colonizing like the rest of the world. Like that's not something that like we as like a modern like group of high schoolers want to be following under. We should be changing this structure, and the way to change that structure is to question the framework, question all of these inherent things that we accept as true or given, and say, hey, maybe that isn't applicable anymore for our society right now, given how different it is, given how diverse it is, how inclusive it is. It's completely not applicable because it's not the same world as when Parli was first created. Then Ob talks about how it's going to be really difficult for observers and judges. We'd say like this isn't a super important point, given that like there is judge training and explanation, and debaters will have to explain like what these frameworks are to judges. So like they'll have to make themselves clear. Like debaters can't just say like we're going to do like deontology and then not explain it to anyone because the judge won't vote for them. So they're still going to have to be able to explain themselves and communicate to the judge, and that practice with communication again is going to be super helpful. Then they talk about how this is going to be like create like just a lot of framework debates instead of debates about certain arguments. However, we think that like as you get more practice with this, like as people get more used to different frameworks, this is going to happen less often, right? Like this is an activity that's been going on for a really long time. So like as people like first try to adjust to something, yes, there will be more framework debates, but we think that like on a net, it's better because you're going to have like a more nuanced idea and more like inclusive idea about like how we should be like looking at the world, because you have different perspectives in it and not just util. So we think that even in the beginning, like there would be like more framework debates. As people get used to it, there will be fewer. Then Side Op talks about how you require better weighing when you do util. Like people have to like tackle like life issues that go on in society and talk about marginalized groups. Once again, this can lead to really harmful rhetoric. So judges, I want you to go back to my contention about where I talk about like harmful rhetoric and how util basically makes debaters like quantify people and like assign values to certain groups of people. That is not something that is like that is not something that anyone should be like wanting to do or should be having to do. You should not be like saying, oh, like this group of people is more important than this group of people. That's not something that like you should be thinking about. That's not like the right way to view people. You shouldn't be viewing people as like values or things or numbers. However, that is what util tells you to do. So the idea that like people are going to tackle life issues that go on in society in a util world is totally true. Like totally buy that from Op, but you also have to buy the fact that like not only do they like talk about these issues, but they talk about them in a way that like really diminishes like individuality of people. They talk about it when like you're just like putting like groups of people on a weighing scale. It takes away from the humanity of individual people, so that's not really a net benefit, and instead it creates all of those impacts that I give you on my first speech about how it makes marginalized groups feel like excluded from debate because they're feeling like their group that they're a part of like has been like ostracized, or like they're being like reduced to just like a number or just a statistic. Then Side Op talks about the harms of alternatives. They basically say that there are two alternatives. One where like it change. Sure.
Do you think there are any weighing mechanisms that actually make it possible to quantify every individual's humanity and actually have a productive debate round?
We would say that like util is kind of like the worst in this. Like we're not saying that like there's a perfect idea of like how to like there's no perfect framework of morality, of course, like otherwise we would be debating under that and not util. But like I think that the idea here is that like util emphasizes like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? It's like very explicitly like majority rules, and that in and of itself just like takes away the personhood of every single individual and turns people into groups of people. Whereas in other forms of morality, like yes, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better at considering individuals utils than util is. So anyway, Op talks about how there's no default. They say that framework debates suck, responded to this. And then when they say that like there will be like a different default, we think that's not true. Like our ideal here is that like there is no kind of like default framework. It's kind of changing up to the whichever round it is, and like the debaters debating there. Okay, now to go back onto gov case, they talk about how the subjectivity of util is what makes it special and how you can decide what's most important. Once again, we think that like this again just leads to like debaters quantifying people, and we think that that's really bad, and that can kind of outweigh here. And now to get into like some preemptive weighing, we think that like a lot of the issues here, a lot of the points are like kind of outweighed on side gov by the fact that like when you're like changing high schoolers' worldview, when you're forcing them to think in a certain way where they're thinking of like other people as like numbers, as like values, as percentages, that's not a good way for them to go into life. It's going to make them less able to critically think, less able to think independently, and they're going to be less open to like marginalized voices, which is a huge impact on this round. Could not be prouder to propose.
Okay, sorry. Hold on 1 second, just getting out my timer. I will begin my speech of 8 minutes with a 30-second grace now. Judge, 3 things in this speech. First, quick top of case observation. Next, op case, then back to gov case. Okay, real issue with this round, real crucial key part of this round is that when Jenny basically asserts that all of our second contention is true, right? The only response that we get from Jenny here is that like, oh, it'll adapt with time. She basically asserts that all of our counterfactual, everything that we tell you about the counterfactual is inherently true, right? So in our entire second contention, we tell you that there's 2 options for this counterfactual. Either A, there is a new default that's picked up, or B, there's a bunch of different weighing mechanisms and people all have to choose. We will prove to you why both of these worlds are bad. Jenny tells you at the top of her speech that like, oh, util will still be an option. Yes, but Sophie tells you why picking a default every round is bad. It is really difficult for people to understand all of these other defaults, yet to learn how to talk about them in debate. Another counterfactual Jenny ignores, what if a new default is, what if another default comes into practice? This could very well be true. If util was the default that came into practice, an accurate depiction of the counterfactual could be that like deontology or something comes into practice, which again is really difficult for people to understand. With that, moving into side government's case. Okay, first contention on non-nuance and bad for high schoolers. The real problem with side government's case is that, as Sophie tells you, the rigid definition of util is really different from how it manifests and how it actually exists in debate. Jenny tells you herself at the top of her PMC that we need to look at the consequences of the framework of util in debate. Okay, we would say that in the Parli space, most people do not use util to justify these harmful and offensive actions and rhetoric. Why? 2 main reasons. First, debaters are moral human beings, i.e., under the rigid definition of util, Hiroshima and Nagasaki might be justified, but the vast majority of debaters would not say that they are. They would not use just util to justify these completely immoral things, because we would say that debaters writ large are moral human beings as well. Secondly, debaters want to win. Even if you buy that like, oh, debaters aren't moral, we tell you that debaters have a unique incentive to win. And since debaters know that judges are people too, even if they feel like they can prove harmful rhetoric using util, they won't do it because no judge would ever vote for it. Most judges would report them to equity and drop them for running something harmful and offensive. Just gut check this. So would their opponents. Their opponents would call them out immediately for it, probably allowing them to open their eyes and maybe change their opinions a little bit, something that Jenny continuously tells you is a good thing. Util allows people with harmful opinions to open their eyes and actually change them and look outside themselves when people are calling them out. Okay, so since this non-nuanced, rigid, harmful definition of util and utilitarian ideas don't actually exist in practice, what actually does happen? Jenny tells you herself that util is subjective. This means that per Sophie's logic, people have to be more creative when using it, right? Debaters have to have nuanced takes on util if they want to win, because it is subjective, but it's also easy to understand. And since people have shown you that debaters, and since we've shown you that debaters are largely moral people and so are judges, this looks like debaters trying to prove why under util, marginalized groups should be prioritized. Many rounds in the status quo literally come down to who does the most good for the most marginalized people, and this all exists under the framework of util in the status quo. This is just really intuitive. We are debating in the status quo. I think 5 of my rounds yesterday came down to ideas about marginalized groups and how we can do best to help them, and this has all existed under util. I think I've learned a lot about these marginalized groups. I think my eyes have opened, my opinions have shifted a lot because of debate, and this is all under the framework of util. Okay, harmful and offensive rhetoric. Let's talk about that. Jenny says this makes debate an unsafe place. We completely agree, but if you buy anything that Sophie and I tell you about the difference between the util definition and util in practice, you really can't buy this. We think that under the util framework, debate has been manifesting and adapting to become a more safe space. This is because we have a default weighing mechanism that allows people to actually analyze motions and cases in more nuanced ways because they have something to work with, right? If people spend 10 seconds trying to understand a weighing mechanism, that means they have 40 minutes to actually get into nuanced, good debates with good arguments from both sides and both opinions, right? But even if you don't buy this, let's look at the counterfactual. It is just as easier, if not easier, to create more sided, less nuanced thinkings in the counterfactual because people's brains are still developing. Now they have to understand a whole new weighing mechanism, which creates even more opportunity for subjectivity, offensive thinking, less nuanced thinking, because one round becomes focused on the framework rather than actual debate, which creates more opportunity for unsafe spaces. Okay, second contention that it makes debaters worse. Jenny basically tells you that debaters only look at a problem through a specific lens. I don't think that has happened in most of the debates today. You can just kind of gut check this, right? If the framework takes 10 seconds to go through, you can analyze every different lens and perspective within the content of the debate. We don't think default being a util being the default framework means that everyone just uses util all the time and no one has nuanced discussions. We actually think that it allows more opportunity for nuanced discussions because it is like some procedure that you can get past and have everyone actually understand debate. Okay, with that, getting into side opposition's case, our first contention on benefits to the quality of the debate round. For our first subpoint of accurate to society, Jenny says that it doesn't matter how you talk about practical issues, but people can still develop different ideas and communicate with different opinions. We would argue that most good debates take place when you get past the framework. Again, most nuanced and creative debates take place in the actual debate space. I think this debate has already been pretty productive, and we are spending most of our time on the actual case, not the framework. I would argue that both sides are expressing creative and nuanced opinions under the default framework of util. This just can't happen to the same extent if debate is all about framework and doesn't make much sense. Second, on polarization, if the framework leads to more different frameworks that actually lead to more polarization, look at the counterfactual. Let's say that there's all these alternate frameworks and they come into practice. Now people have all these different opinions and polarizing views, and now they can use these frameworks to justify that. That could be really, really uniquely harmful. Next, on K's, maybe that's how they were created. Maybe they were created to help talk about marginalized groups and communities, but unfortunately, judges, that's just not how they operate in practice. That's why the NYPDL has literally banned K's, because they're just so inaccessible. Okay, and then Jenny says it doesn't matter if judges are confused. It absolutely matters if judges are confused. They are literally deciding who wins the round. Debaters have a unique incentive to win the round and to appeal to judges. Okay, then we talk about how it keeps people on their feet. They say that this is a really, really big point that I really want to emphasize. Jenny's main point is that there will be framework debates at first, but then overall, eventually these framework debates will disappear. Okay, sure, this makes sense in theory over time, right? But two responses to this. One, it's probably untrue because again, no framework is as easy to understand as util. So if it takes me 10 seconds to understand util and 6 months to understand deontology, this means that A, all these other frameworks are so inaccessible, and B, people will have to spend so long trying to understand them, which makes this process of it being more and more exclusionary take so so long. So for a large portion of time, debate will be inaccessible, really, really exclusionary, and probably fall off as an extracurricular because people think it is so inaccessible. Okay, next on the idea of harmful rhetoric and the idea of numbers. Final thing I want to emphasize, people are not viewed as numbers in intellectual debate. That's not how it manifests. In my last round, we looked at the individual under the framework. Judge, I ask you this though, even if you buy that everyone turns into a number, is there really a framework that really accurately quantifies every individual's humanity? Jenny tells you to emphasize emphasizing the majority, but she misses the point. The quantifiable nature of people and the harmful rhetoric are not a problem of util. They are a problem of the inherent biases that people have. The only way to get rid of those biases, judges, is if people have time to debate the actual case, if people have time to critically think when they get past the framework. That is the only way to humanize people and humanize debate. With that, I strongly urge a side opposition ballot. Thank you, judges and opponents. All right. Okay. Awesome. Yes, it was a fantastic speech. Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay. I'll begin my time of 4 minutes starting now. I want to do 3 things in the speech. First, I want to characterize this round, make it really clear for you what these two worlds look like. Then I want to talk about what I predict Jenny's Gov collapse to be and explain to you why it won't win. And third and finally, I want to talk about the op collapse and why we can independently win this round. First, let's talk about the two worlds. Counterintuitively to what Jenny may say, Gov's world is harmful. I agree. There's no perfect moral system. If we found one, we'd probably be debating under it. But what regretting util does is it decreases accessibility and makes it hard to learn. Op-world helps people learn. Low barrier to entry at absolute minimum, you get more people debating and allow the debate space to be more accessible. In PMR, Gov will probably say 2 things. I'm sometimes bad at predicting Jenny's collapse. First, I think Jenny will probably tell you that util causes people to quantify and weigh people in a harmful way and say bad things about them. But Emily have a few responses that make this argument, even if it's true, not super winning. First, we say, or I say in my POI, that framework and no framework truly doesn't weigh people. Even if util is the worst, every framework has to weigh people and dehumanize people in the weighing sense to some level. So even if util is somewhat worse, it's not enough worse that it's worth getting rid of all of the benefits we give you later on in this round. The second thing that we tell you is that people are moral. Even if it's bad, and like util can be bad, people in a debate round won't be horrible. They come to debate to have moral conversations, not to be bad. So yes, people can still be hurt, but not as intentionally and not as much. So even if it happens, it's not intentional, probably happens under other weighing mechanisms. Third, Emily tells you, debaters adjust so they don't lose. They will never be intentionally saying bad things. So even if it's possible that debaters could say bad things under util, they probably won't. The probability of it is low and probably isn't going to affect people. Fourth, Emily tells you that debating case is how you get rid of these biases, because people have biases. The framework isn't the problem. You're more likely to get rid of these biases when you actually debate the case and content and debate the arguments, meaning that even if it's true that potentially in this world that you can weigh people and it can be harmful and you can say bad things, we really minimize it by debating under util and having a set default framework. Also, Emily says you can also turn this, and these frameworks can be used to help marginalize if you have bad quality frameworks. The second and important thing that that Jenny will probably tell you in PMR is that this new quality, this new util, makes debaters worse by only using utilitarianism. But Emily tells you 2 things that I think pretty accurately take this argument down. First, we can have a high quality debate. We are right now. I've had it every other one of my rounds. We get to talk about the content, not just the debate round. We're talking about the net benefits to debaters. It's not util, but it's rather similar. And we're able to have a high quality debate round just as much. The second thing that Emily tells you is you're also able to spend more time on content, analyzing more types of things and not just the same amount of things. On numbers, there are more different types of arguments than there are frameworks. You're able to analyze more things purely based on numbers if you're only analyzing the arguments versus the frameworks in 4 minutes of that round, meaning you're probably going to learn about more things in our world. That being said, let's talk about 3 independent ways we win. First, more time in arguments. I just talked about that. There are more arguments possible than possible frameworks. This leads to more interesting rounds since you're talking about more things, more long-term education since you get to learn how different things interact in the world. Why is that important? Because if you can memorize all of the arguments, that's not as good as Parli because you can memorize all of the frameworks. But if you can if you can come up with the arguments every single time, you're probably going to be learning more. Memorizing frameworks doesn't get the same benefit. The second important place we're winning is on accessibility. We think just rather simply people understand util. That is something we will never change and something that is vital. Why is accessibility important? Because even if Jenny is right about the debate space being really toxic to marginalized people. This is a prerequisite. We allow people to get into the debate space in the first place because we make it comfortable enough and accessible enough. So even if it's problematic once we get here, at least we get people there to talk about the problems, to have conversations, engage in argumentation, because they actually understand the framework you're talking about. That's always going to be a priority and come first. Third and final place we win is on long-term weighing. We think Jenny tells you that you understand how to communicate better no matter what with debate. We tell you you understand how to communicate and also understand issues because you talk about issues that are relevant under util. The point at which we get you both and not just the one of learning how to understand how to debate and talk in the world, we're really, really, really proud to oppose.
Another wonderful speech. Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay. With that, I will begin. Oh, I'll just do a quick so I'll be jumping around a little bit, like doing some refutations from op block, but I'll mostly be identifying clean like gov ballots and then talking about the big clashes in the debate. Okay. So I will begin my time now. So there are two ways that you can clearly vote op here. The first one is about applicability to the real world. So my point about how practical issues in the real world are not like on the same reality plane often between certain groups, like kind of goes dropped by op. They kind of just say, oh, but like you'll understand the issues more. However, what I told you in my MG is that like when you have a conversation like in the present day with someone from like a different political party than you are, oftentimes you're just like you don't have the same understanding of the world, right? Like completely different like ideas, completely different like mechanisms of like weighing what's important. Like we are incredibly polarized to the point where like people of like those differing beliefs have completely different understandings of what is important and what they should value. So in the status quo, like we are basically like arguing and debating with people who have different ideas of frameworks in their head. We have that. So the best way to be able to learn how to deal with people like that, people who believe things so vastly different to us, is to learn how to understand their framework, what they're thinking, and learn how to adapt to that. You only get that practical experience on side gov. Second clean gov ballot here is the idea of criticizing the system itself. So what I tell you is that debate in and of itself is inherently inequitable, right? It was created by an oppressive system. We cannot call ourselves equitable or truly inclusive unless if we're working under a system that hasn't been changed in centuries. The idea of this framework has been used to justify countless atrocities against people. And yes, op tells you, oh, like there is nothing, like no better option. However, that doesn't change the fact that like we're still debating under and therefore like passively endorsing something that was created by people who use the idea of utilitarianism to justify countless atrocities. Like that is not something that we should be doing. That is not something we should be endorsing as debaters. That is not something that we should be doing if we want to keep this space open and equitable to everyone. So those are two clean gov ballots there. And now let's get into like the main clashes. So a big clash is about like what's good for debaters. So basically what I want to talk about is debaters' ability to think independently, their critical independent thinking. So you can impact this out to like group think, like hive mind, like inability to make independent decisions, right? Society relies on the fact that people think independently and express their ideas to create civil discourse. Without the idea that concepts of worldview can be different, Parli debaters become super narrow-minded. Gov promotes creative thinking. Now, what op tells you is that like focusing on arguments leads to more creative thinking than like just focusing on like the frameworks. However, there are only so many arguments you can make in every single debate round. Like there's a reason why debate becomes kind of repetitive at a certain point. Like the way to think about motions and problems in new ways is to measure them in different ways, like measure them in like different perspectives. Think about them through different lenses. That's how you actually get a better understanding of the world, if you look at it not only through like your own vantage point, but try to see it from someone else's vantage point. We win on the idea of creative thinking, of free thinking, and of independent thinking for debaters. Then the other point that I want to touch on is accessibility. So the first thing I want to talk about is like clarity and like explaining different frameworks. So I want to repeat what I said in my MG speech about how like if you pick a different framework, like you're going to be forced to explain it to like anyone, right? So like you're not going to pick something crazy weird that you take like 7 minutes explaining in your gov case, right? You're going to explain something that like people can understand. So like the idea that like op is giving you that people are going to pick like really weird crazy frameworks is probably just like unlikely because of the fact that like you're still going to have to explain it. Like debate in and of itself is about clarity. That's why like we're not going up here and like quoting like Aristotle or Plato about like morality, because it wouldn't make sense, because judges wouldn't buy it. Anything you do, even if it's like a little like confusing, you have to clearly explain it. So it stands to reason that debaters would not be like going like these crazy routes to like win and use like super weird frameworks. They would probably use things that are generally easy to understand. But the misconception that OP gives you, that util is the only framework that is easy to understand, is the reason why people have justified keeping util as our like default framework for like the entirety of Parli's existence. People assume that that's the only one that's easy to understand, whereas actually, because we just haven't interacted with other kinds of frameworks, because we just don't engage in them, because we have a default, then people don't understand the other ones because they just haven't been exposed to it. Like showing people that there are other options, showing people that these are like existing and like viable, are like the way that we can minimize this idea of like confusion and like the idea of like exclusivity.
Hello. Sorry, this whole idea that there's like all these other existing frameworks that are like super, super understandable and all that, it seems a little new, but
Let me go on my flow.
especially the analysis. I think you might have said that once, but all the analysis at the end seems new.
I was basically extending through in your let me see where it is. Wait, op case. When you were talking about in your C1 about in your C1 about like accessibility, my response was talking about how like people are going to have to like, explain themselves clearly, and so clear, and like that I tie that into my like clear communication point. That's where at least I have it on my flow. So
Yeah, no.
judge's discretion. I had my time at 4 minutes and 7 seconds. Is everyone okay if I? Okay, great. I will restart my time now. So basically, judges, what you get from Gov is you get 2 easy, clean voter ballots, right? You get applicability to the real world, and you get the fact that like the system itself is inherently flawed, and therefore we should be working to change it, and we should not just be like working like under it and kind of like trying to improve things. We should be attacking like the system itself that upholds these exclusive values. Then you also get, on the main like points of clash, you get better debaters who are able to think independently and creatively on side Gov. And furthermore, you get a more accessible world, because like not only are people expected to explain themselves clearly in both op and gov world, but uniquely on side Gov, you get all of the impacts that I lay out in my very first speech about like exclusivity and harms to debaters. Even if you don't buy that point, even if you buy all of ops rhetoric about how like there's exclusivity, about how like it's not going to be changed, you can still independently vote for Gov on the fact that it's more applicable to the real world, and criticizing the system is the most important thing in this debate. So proud to propose.
Thank you to both teams. That was an excellent debate.
Great job. Yeah.
You guys are so great. I'm #1 fan.
This was terrific. Okay, should we judges take a few minutes independently to do our thing, and then what do we do? We vote and then we come back and give feedback?
Yeah. I think whoever votes last will know what the result was. So why don't we just all vote and then come back here, and whoever votes last, why don't you turn your camera on, and that's how we'll all know the ballot's done.
Okay, sounds good.
Excellent. So interestingly, we have a 2-1 decision. And it came down to Gov, a 2-1 decision for Gov.
Really?
Yeah. I thought this was very close.
It definitely was, and it was really well done. I'm the op vote. So do you want me to start?
I think usually, yeah, that's if you're the why don't you start, and then we can we'll take it the other side and we'll see if we can just rehash the debate.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So look, I think the way I saw this, the Gov side, which even though my vote was for op, I thought argued the point, as well as one could argue this point. I think has a more the fundamental thing that I thought op did really persuasively was it brought the discussion back to the reality of what goes on in debate. Whereas I think Gov had maybe philosophically, in some sense, the more persuasive point, but I thought that op really successfully established that, in fact, some of the risks of the default utilitarian framework don't actually come to pass, or there are other things that can be done to address those risks that are done in Parli debate. And also that there are certain advantages to the utilitarian framework and disadvantages of the no default framework position that Gov was arguing for. So, for example, this risk of the creation of a hostile debate space. I thought that op really successfully explained that the sorts of arguments that might reject the need of a marginalized group because the greater good was served in some way are not arguments that folks are actually going to make. They're not going to be winning arguments. There's sort of extensive focus and training on, not creating a hostile environment. There's the equity violation allegations that can be made. And so I thought that risk was really more theoretical than actual. And I thought op made that point really successfully. I also do think that the accessibility point, there's sort of an interesting tension between the theoretical risk that an argument might create a hostile space and the more actual risk that I thought was more persuasive that op outlined, which was you create a series of these frameworks that are like complex and unique, and either everyone has to spend a lot of time debating the framework, which I think does keep a lot of people on the outside, particularly people who aren't as, who don't maybe have the same level of education or who aren't as familiar with debate, makes it less accessible to them. And I thought that was sort of an actual practical reason that you may actually create more of a hostile environment if you change that framework. I was not persuaded by the Gov's point that there's a sort of negative impact on the brains of debaters, because when they use the utilitarian framework, they think in an overly simplistic and non-nuanced way. And again, I think op made the point really persuasively that because utilitarianism is subjective, I think people are not, as a practical matter, and op made this point, I think both Sophie and Emily said this, that it's not as if debaters actually get up there and say, well, we should win because, more people are going to benefit from one position than another position. There is a subjective argument that in fact happens because it's not so clear to what every person and every judge what utilitarianism means. And so that kind of nuanced discussion that often does focus on the needs of marginalized group, in fact, happens. So I think in Gov world, we're solving a theoretical problem potentially and creating, I think, more actual problems and ignoring some actual benefits. But I thought you all did a fantastic job. Like, in addition to my own flow, I had to make a little chart to try to evaluate like who was on what side. I've seen you guys debate a number of times now, and you're just terrific. And this was a great discussion. So I think you should all feel great about the job you did. And thank you. I also learned a lot from listening to you guys. So I will turn it over to the majority judges now.
Sure. Elizabeth, you want me to say a few things and then I'll pass it off to you?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, because I actually agree with a huge amount of what Jocelyn just said, and emphatically agree this was an excellent debate on both sides. And I actually was with op on a lot of the sort of practical depiction of how arguments play out in practice of most of the rounds that we see here as judges, I agreed with Opp's sort of characterization of government as constructing a straw man in terms of how utilitarianism actually tends to play out in practice as a framework for judging and for debating. And I thought Opp had the better of the argument on, I'm trying to think of how best to put this. I'll call it sort of let me put this differently. I agreed that government was overstating the sort of potential risks to debaters of applying crude utilitarianism, although I have seen debates where crude utilitarianism has been a framework that debaters sort of were tempted by. But where I was with Gov is I thought Gov made a number of pretty compelling arguments that actually opening up debate over framework itself in a world where there is profound disagreement, not just about sort of policy and facts, but also a profound disagreement about sort of what value lenses and what moral frameworks should be brought to bear to understand basic questions of social policy and basic questions of how this country, I thought the example of an upcoming congressional shutdown where it looks like we've got multiple sides in Congress who really do sort of view the world not just through different sets of facts and not just through different sets of facts and policy preferences, but through different values. And I thought government made a bunch of pretty compelling arguments that should be part of the terrain of debate, that if we limit ourselves just to utilitarianism, there's a real risk that people sort of leave debate limited in their ability to speak across sort of moral chasms. And I thought government made a bunch of pretty compelling arguments on that point. I thought government made compelling arguments that utilitarianism as a philosophy comes with a history anchored in power, and it is not a neutral philosophy. It's a philosophy that comes from a particular place, and it comes from a particular history of power that debaters should be aware of and should be sort of trained to be critical about. And that the history of debate, and I actually thought the back and forth about the history of K's was interesting, where I thought the Gov made some interesting points, made some interesting arguments about the idea that debate about debate and debate about the value frameworks of debate has its history in marginalized groups trying to insert themselves into the debate space, and pointed to the ban on Ks in sort of the East Coast versus West Coast style debate, pointed to the ban on Ks in the East Coast as in some ways a repression of what was an effort, call it almost an insurrectionary effort, to expand the terrain of debate. And I thought that was an interesting argument that I didn't really hear a response from Opp to, other than to say, this is just going to make debate less accessible and make debate harder to get into. And I wanted to hear more from Opp sort of engaging with this idea that debate itself has a history of power, and debate itself has a history of these revolutions against the historical power of debate in attempts to expand the vocabulary and sphere of debate. And I thought I found those interesting arguments, and I didn't really hear Opp engaging with them. And so that, even though I agreed with Opp in terms of the day-to-day, how does utilitarianism typically play out in practice? No, people aren't typically deploying it to make amoral arguments. But I thought Gov made a lot of interesting arguments about the historical sort of power structures of debate that, to me, ultimately carried the day. But I thought it was very close, because I actually, sort of the empirical description of debate as it typically happens minute to minute, I thought Opp probably was more accurately describing the world all of us experience on a regular basis. So I found this very close. I ultimately came down Gov, but that's sort of where my head was at with the ballot. And now I will stop talking.
Okay, great. I mean, I know everyone said this, but this is genuinely such an amazing debate. I believe I agree with points made by both the other judges. So I guess we'll just talk a little bit about I split this debate up into like three major categories when I was sort of coming to my decision. The first was whether or not this spreads a uniquely harmful rhetoric. Two, accessibility, and three, this sort of like educational aspect of debate. So on this idea of like utilitarianism, specifically the form of it being used in debate and whether or not it's uniquely harmful marginalized communities, I actually sided with the opposition on this one. I agree that like the way utilitarianism has been used in debate has not really necessarily had like a uniquely harmful effect, nor is there sort of an alternative framework that's going to be like more beneficial or that's going to humanize people in a better way. Then on accessibility, I didn't sort of buy this point as much because I agree with what government was saying, which is that a major incentive for debate is to win, right? People want to win. And if you have an inaccessible framework, if you're unable to explain your framework to the judge and to the other team, then you're simply not going to be able to win this debate. And thus people are going to use sort of more like people are going to take the time to explain their framework in a good, accessible way. And so what this debate ultimately came down for me it was this idea of learning and what's sort of a more productive debate, to have like sort of unique frameworks and like taking into account these unique perspectives, or to spend more time talking about the actual points under the utilitarian framework. And so as you can tell by the way I voted, I ultimately buy the idea simply because I feel like we got more warranting about why it's uniquely productive to spend time evaluating debates using different frameworks. And that the idea that simply relying on utilitarianism isn't going to be productive in like the real world, because people don't always have the same framework and moral framework, and that it's sort of better to have unique perspectives and take into account different frameworks. One thing I noted when I was sort of like writing my RFD, though I'm not submitting a written RFD, but just like writing out some of my thoughts was, and I didn't vote off this, but I thought it could have been a pretty good place for me to vote, was that the keeps people on their feet point given by opposition almost concedes this whole idea about learning in the first place, right? This idea that like a good part about Parli, what makes Parli so unique, is that it trains you to think on your feet. It trains you to like think about different perspectives, and that's something that I honestly would have flowed to Jenny's side had it been extended. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was just also something I thought was worth noting. But yeah, I thought this was a great round. If anyone has any specific questions about my decision, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, judges, and this was one of the best rounds ever. So interesting.
Congrats.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say thank you, a huge thank